Masa, you've told us so much about your family, and we've enjoyed those stories, but we would love to hear again about your father.
Oh, gosh. Well, that is one of my very, very favorite stories. So this is wonderful. I'm very happy to tell it to the generations and whoever else might be interested. But it's the story, oh God, and then I'm going to get all emotional. But anyway, it's the story of how my father came to America, which I think is probably that I heard over and over and over again in my childhood, and probably was the greatest influence in my life. And what happened was, just to back up a tiny bit, he was born on the cusp of, or rather his mother was born on the cusp of Japan's entry into the modern world from a feudal society. And so coming into that milieu with a grandmother who grew up in feudal Japan, a mother who was born when it all changed the same year the Commodore Perry steamed into Tokyo Bay, and then being a product of that mother and that grandmother and that family, which had lived in the family home, originally a samurai brought from the south of Japan, for approximately 700 years at the time my father was born. So he was born into a family of formerly samurai until 1853, and then they became what you might call hereditary mayors of the village. And he was the middle of 11 children, and so not very important really in a mostly agrarian-based community. And actually he was very mischievous and not that much into school. And but he had a wonderful time. He adored his mother and his sisters, mostly because they let him get away with everything and would give him candy and this and that kind of thing. But at any rate, he had a very, very happy, playful, joyous childhood, all of which changed when he was age 13. Because at age 13, he chanced upon a slim volume about democracy written by a Frenchman that had been translated into Japanese. And so I personally think that that was de Tocqueville, who had visited America during the Revolution and talked about American democracy and what that meant. And from the moment my father read that, it was his entire aim in life to come to the United States. So he immediately hied himself to the local missionary with the intent of learning English. And so I always jokingly say that as opposed to those who joined the missionaries or went to church in order to get their bowl of rice and became known as rice Christians, he became an English Christian due to the fact that he joined the church or went to the missionary so that he could learn English. Well, after about 2 years of study with the missionary, he felt that he needed to practice with actual English speakers. And so every Sunday he would walk over the mountains. It was a mountainous region, Kanuma, where he was born, in the center of Japan, to Utsunomiya, which was the local town, a little tiny town in the mountains in those days, that had a railroad stop, a little narrow gauge railroad, and hope, something like hoping a Cadillac is going to drive through the middle of the Sahara in 1900 or 1898, so that you could get a ride in a Cadillac. But at any rate, I always liken it to Huck Finn deciding in the middle of Missouri in 18-something that he would go to Japan with the same prospect of success. Every Sunday he would hike over the mountains, stand on the railroad platform in Utsunomiya, and hope that a European, American, English-speaking person would get off the train so that he could practice his English. Of course, weeks, months would go by. Nobody would get off that was an English speaker, or they might be European but Italian or German or some other non-English speaker. But one day, an entire American family, kind of the around-the-world trip that people of means used to take as a cultural tour, got off the train And he was an American family, you know, complete with the trunks, the maids, and everything else for this around the world grand tour. And he noticed that there was a boy his age among them. And so he went up to the boy and started engaging him in conversation. And so they invited him to ride with them, the family, until the next stop. And so he got in conversation with the father and told him about his dream of coming to the United States. And the father was a Mr. George Chaffee, who is president of the bank in Rutland, Vermont. And he gave my father a book of Mark Twain's and said, that famous phrase, "If you ever get to America, we would welcome you." Well, that was all my father needed to hear. And so he immediately, almost that night or the next night, decided that he would leave for Yokohama. And walked to Yokohama, which took him 2 weeks. And when he got to Yokohama, he looked for a job on the docks, which was easy for him to find, even though at that point he was about 15 years old, because he was an English speaker and got hired on the docks and then just went around to all the boats looking for a job on a ship that would take him to the United States. And so eventually he did. He found a job as a cabin boy on the bark Brilliant. And they set sail early in 1905. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the ship that my father brought to the United States. And it was the bark Brilliant, and it was a 3-masted schooner. And he had quite a number of adventures on that. He learned for the very first time in his life when he landed in Australia, he danced with a white woman. He had never danced that kind of dancing before. And the whole sort of white society and all the sailors were having fun with all the prostitutes in town. And it was a completely new world to him. And then on the trip to Iquique, Chile, they crossed the equator. And all the new sailors were initiated by having all their body hair shaved off, which he found another unique experience. And went to Iquique, Chile, and loaded nitrate, unloaded the oil or coal, loaded the nitrate, and then around Cape Horn, which was quite a dangerous journey, climbing up the masts during the storms and so forth. And some sailors were lost during that time. And then coming up the coast of South America until finally they reached Boston. And probably one of the adventures he talks about a lot is that the ship's crew, he was the youngest, he was a cabin boy, and he was the youngest person on board. So if the sailors got bored, they sometimes chased him around, and so he would dash into the galley and get a pot of boiling water and defend himself by threatening to throw it on the sailors. And at any rate, he made it to Rutland, Vermont. And I have the ship's log here, which he kept. And every single day he would make a note into the log. And it's really interesting because in some of the pages there you find English words such as birthday on April 3rd, which was his birthday, seasick, captain, and other English words, shilling, how much he got paid. And this was a habit he kept throughout his entire life. He, maybe because his father was a tax collector in Kanuma, but at any rate, well renowned for his honesty. But my father kept the ship's log in which he every single day noted his activities, and that continued throughout his life. He noted down where he went, or at least how much he spent on what. So finally, he arrived in Boston and sent a telegram to Mr. Chaffee, president of the Rutland Savings Bank, that he had arrived in the United States. The other thing that he did, which was typical of my father and also typical of his class, which had been the samurai class at that time, pre the change, pre-modernization, was that he refused Mr. Chaffee's offer to pay for his passage to come to the United States, but rather insisted that since he had already signed on this ship as a cabin boy, that he would honor that contract and come to the United States working his way. So he was picked up from the ship in Boston. And it's just amazing how different immigration was in those days. There's a one-piece piece of paper that just says he's allowed to come in, and went to Rutland, Vermont, where suddenly from his home in Japan, he was in this grand stone edifice, complete with barns, horses, carriages, and all the accoutrements of a banker. And Mr. Chaffee offered to send him to college here. And again, he refused because he thought it was too much to accept from somebody. And it was the one regret he had in life, that he did not accept that offer to go to college. And obviously, in 1905, to be Japanese, to have the command of the Japanese language, as well as the English language and all of the educational background and degrees and contacts that he would have had quite a different life had he accepted. But at any rate, he went to Rutland, Vermont, fell in love with it, fell in love with the countryside, just loved the Chaffees. He was one of the family. Went to work in Mr. Chaffee's lumber mill because his father had also had a lumber business. And fell in love with a Vermont girl and experienced prejudice for the first time in his life, because her family would not allow her to marry him because he was Japanese. And I think that his experience of prejudice, which I really felt because I had such a close tie with him, both fueled his drive to his abhorrence of prejudice of any kind, and my own kind of social activist bent, because I hate prejudice of any kind also. At any rate, apart from that, he had a wonderful time in Vermont and always considered himself a, quote, Green Mountain boy. And it completely changed his dietary preferences, because his main thing was bacon and eggs in the morning, steak whenever he could get it, apple pie with ice cream and cheese. And one of his favorite sayings was, I guess it's an old Vermont saying, apple pie without cheese is like a kiss without a squeeze. So at any rate, he stayed in Vermont for approximately, I would guess, about 5 or 6 years, and then decided to come to New York and set up his own business. He had had a furniture business in Vermont, but decided he just wanted to do something different. He was in partnership. He was selling on the installment plan, and when local farmers couldn't pay their monthly bills, he didn't have the heart to go chase them down and take their cribs away from their babies. So that business did not do that well. And he came to New York, where he set up a silk kimono manufacturing business. And this was during the 20s, in the height of the flapper and all the great things going on in the 20s in New York. A lot of prosperity before the stock market crash, and silk kimonos were pretty much the craze. So he met my mother in New York, and that was that. They seemed perfectly matched to each other. Neither of them drank, neither of them smoked, and both of them were hardworking and honest. So they felt that it was a good match, and they married.